everybody, Mike Iaconelli back out here in the shop on a windy day, and I'm about to give you the goods on this one. We're going to talk about a technique that is still really new, and it's still what I would call a hot, trending technique, especially here in the United States. In other parts of the country, in Japan, this technique has caught on a lot quicker. But in the States, people are still trying to figure this one out. And today we're going to talk about a technique that presents the lure in a different and unique way. And the bottom line is this one's going to get you bites when normal Texas rig stuff will not get you bites. And today we're going to be talking about a modification of a technique called the free rig. And this one is called, you ready? The floating free rig. The floating free rig. And let me tell you, this is a special one. This is a slight modification on the traditional free rig that's going to present the bait in a very unique nose down, tail up, semi-floating way. And it's something the fish don't see. This technique I'm going to talk about works in every situation you could imagine. Muddy, stained, clear, crystal clear water. It works for smallmouth, largemouth, spotted bass. It works winter, spring, summer, and fall. And it is a killer technique on fish you can see. If you're bed fishing or sight fishing, or if you see them cruising around, they won't bite anything, this is a killer. So let's go through this, and I want to show you how to rig this floating free rig, and then we'll talk a little bit about how to fish it, and we'll end with the right equipment, okay? All right, first things first. On our line, we're going to go ahead and rig a weight stop, okay? A weight stop. And you guys have seen me use these before. These they're also called bobber stops, but it's just, these are little bait by VMC. They're on a wire form, and on these wires, there are these little black, like pegs almost. And you put your line through one of the wire forms, you grab the black peg, and you slide that peg onto your line, okay? So first thing we're going to do is put a bobber stop on, a weight stop. When you put that on, let's get that out of the way. You can slide that way up the line. Let's get that way out of the way. We don't need that again right now, okay? The next thing we're going to add is our weight. And in free rigging and the floating free rig, you're going to need a bit of a specialty weight. And the main thing you need is you need a weight that has a closed eye molded into the top of the weight, okay? A closed eye. Not a drop shot weight that has the line pincher, not that little V, that little tight V line pincher, but you need a drop shot weight or a weight that has a closed eye. There's a lot of weights out there in different shapes. They've got long cylinders, teardrops. They've got round weights, pointed weights. You could even use like a catfish, a bank sinker, if you wanted to. This is the one I really like. This is one that I'm working on with VMC. We're going to launch this one real soon, but it's just a VMC pencil drop shot weight. It's tungsten, but it's got a closed eye on it, okay? We're going to get that closed eye weight, and we're going to thread it through our line. There you go. Look at her. She's just sliding around. There's our weight, whatever style you like. The main thing is it has to have a closed eye so it can slide, okay? Let's let that get out of here. Next thing, and I've seen anglers use or not use this, but I like it. And you can get them in a lot of different colors. I'm using an orange one so you guys can see them. I like black. I've used red ones. They also make them in clear. This is a 10 millimeter plastic bead. Okay, a small plastic bead. A little smaller than the ones you'd use for a Carolina rig. This is 10 millimeter. And then you're going to thread that bead on your line. Okay? See that little fluorescent bead? 10 millimeter? Okay? That bead's going to go on. All right, let's get that out of the way. It's down there with the rest of those guys. All right, and last but not least, now we're going to tie on our hook. All right, now pay attention, because I know what you're thinking. Yeah, Mike, you're tying up a free rig. Everything you've used so far is a free rig. Okay, but guess what? This is the floating free rig, and this technique's a little more finesse than traditional free rigging. And because of that, we're going to use a more finesse style hook. So in this one, depending on the size of the bait you're going to pick, I want you to use a number 1 or a number 2, right? Either one. They're both small. Number 1 or number 2 VMC finesse Nico hook. A number 1 or a number 2 VMC finesse Nico hook. This, listen to me, this is the perfect hook for this floating free rig, okay? And when you look at that hook, it's pretty special because it's got a Nico shape to it, right? It's a cross between a wacky style and a straight shank. It's got a little keeper barb on it, little fluorocarbon keeper barb. But here's the most important thing about this hook. You ready? It's light wire. It's light wire. So a number 1 or a number 2 light wire hook is a must for this. You cannot, please do not use a hook that has a heavy gauge because this floating free rig will not work the same. Okay, so let's tie this thing on. A number 1 or a number 2 finesse Nico hook by VMC, lighter gauge hook. Tie that on there real quick. Okay, and now, you ready? Now we've got our components all set. Okay, everything's set. We've got, you ready? We've got our weight stop. We've got our closed eye weight. We've got our bead, which is going to act for sound and as a knot protector. And last but not least, we have our hook, a number 1 or number 2 VMC finesse Nico hook. Now, let's get to the meat, and then we're going to see why this thing is so deadly, why this floating free rig is so deadly. When you pick a lure for this rig, here's the only thing I'm asking you to do. Pick one that has a floating nature to the bait. There's a lot of really good plastics on the market now that are high buoyancy, high floating baits. This is one of them. It's not the only one. This is one of them. This is one that I love on this floating free rig. This is a bait by Berkeley Power Bait called a water bug. And the water bug has a special floating, high density floating material. So it keeps that water bug floating. It comes in a 4-inch and it comes in a 3.5-inch, 2 sizes. And other companies make floating material stuff, right? You know the other companies out there. Use a plastic that is floating, okay? All right, last but not least on this floating free rig, we're either gonna thread it or Texas rig it. I'll thread this water bug and leave the hook exposed when there's no cover, right? When there's no cover down there. When there's no grass, wood, rock, weeds, when there's nothing to get snagged on, I thread it. And my hookup ratio gets way better. But in normal cover fishing, if you're fishing around grass, or sticks or brush or logs or docks. A lot of times we're fishing around cover. I just Texas rig that water bug, right? And I go in 1/8 of an inch, pop out, want that hook popping out on the flat side. I want that flat side facing down. I turn the bait around, I get it past that fluorocarbon keeper, and I do my normal Texas rig. And I'll even sometimes just push that hook out a little bit so it's exposed. Okay, so now here's what we end up with. Now here's the whole thing. You ready? Weight stop, bobber stop, closed eye weight, bead, and there's our floating soft plastic, which in this case is the Berkley Power Bait Water Bug. And now, let me get to why this thing is so good. Unlike a Texas rig, unlike a wacky rig, unlike a Ned rig, unlike a drop shot, unlike any other soft plastic that we're fishing, when we throw this thing out there, the weight lands in the water, the bead follows it down, and when it hits the bottom, this bait floats up off the bottom, right? It floats. We can adjust the float rate, how high we want it off the bottom, based on that weight stop. Think about that. Think about the adjustability of this on the fly. Look at that little black weight stop. And if I'm fishing on a bed and I want it floating just off the bottom, I'll take this weight stop, I'll pull it up maybe 2 inches from the bait, and now when it hits, the weight lands in the bed, the bead lands in the bed, and that water bug floats straight up above it. And it sits like that. I can shake my rod, the weight's causing a little debris on the bottom, and that water bug's sitting above it, twitching, hovering, shaking. A floating bait, a floating free rig. Look, notice they call it a free rig because that weight is not impeding on the action of that water bug at all. That water bug's doing its own thing, floating up here in the back. It's not impeding on the action. That weight is not impeding on the hook set. Think about a Texas rig bait that you throw in the bed. Boom, it lands straight on the bottom. The weight is attached to the head, or a shaky head, or a tube, or a Ned head. The weight and the bait are all one piece. On the bottom, when the fish grabs it, often that weight impedes on the hook set. But what about the floating? What about the floating free rig? Oh no, that weight's out of the way. That bait's floating up above it, okay? Man, what a great system. What a unique way to present a bait. Let me give you another scenario though. You ready? What if we're fishing over submerged grass? Let's say it's milfoil, or it's new growth hydrilla, or maybe you're up north and it's sandgrass. You're on one of the Great Lakes and you're fishing around gobies and you got sandgrass that sits about 6, 8 inches above the bottom. You ready for this? You ready? Take the weight stop, the bobber stop, and pull it up about 10 or 14 inches. Pull it up 16 inches, whatever you want. Now, when you throw out there in that submerged grass, that weight hits, it lands on the bottom, makes a little puff of smoke. It's gone through that grass, causing ruckus. The bait, floating above the grass, floating above the cover, floating out of the rocks, above the stick, visible, full of action, not impeded by the weight, doing its own thing, floating up above in the fish's face. It's the floating free rig. It's unbelievable. It's a great technique. Before I get into rod, reel, line, let me just tell you a little bit about the ways that I fish it. And I fish the floating free rig a lot like I would a standard Texas rig or a shaky head, right? A lot of the same way. Even maybe a little bit like a Carolina rig. I like to throw it out there in that bed or in that grass or in that weed. I like to let it sink to the bottom. Boom. Once it hits the bottom, I like to shake it. I'll use a lot of shaking in place. And remember, when that weight's on the ground, on the floor of the bottom, and you're just shaking, you're leaving it in place, shaking your rod tip, right? Look, that weight's down there, tung, 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 tung. There's that bead. That bead's hitting the weight a little, tung, 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 tung. Make a little ticking, tick, 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 tick. And that, as you shake, that floating bait, that water bug's dancing up off the bottom. So I like to do a lot of shaking, and I also like to do a lot of dragging. In situations where it's deeper and there's less specific cover, right? If you're fishing a point or you're out over a deep flat and you're doing more water, you're covering more water, non-specific targets, I do a lot of dragging. Like a big Texas rig, like a Texas rig worm, like a Carolina rig, and I'll just drag it slow from about 3 o'clock to 12 o'clock, try to maintain that weight on the bottom, but I always follow it with pauses. And especially if I feel something. If I'm dragging it and I feel it hit something, like it gets stuck for a second or hit something on the bottom, I'll pause it. The pauses are key because when you drag, you're dragging that thing, and a lot of times the bait will pull forward as you drag. But when you pause, that bait will float back up. And just that motion of that floating lure going from low to higher up, just that little motion on that pause will create a lot of bites. All right, let's get into rod, reel, and line. And you can honestly fish this floating free rig on both spinning and casting. My general rule of thumb is if I'm using a weight that's a 1/4 ounce or less, I like to throw it on a spinning rod. I like a 7-foot medium action spinning rod with a 20 or 30 size spinning reel. I'm using Abu Garcia Ike Revo stuff. 7-foot medium action spinning rod if that weight's less than a 1/4 ounce. If that weight's more than a 1/4 ounce, a lot of times I'll use 3/8, a 1/2 ounce, deeper water. I like it on a 7-foot medium heavy action casting rod. Pair it with a low profile, 7-to-1, 8-to-1, something higher gear ratio casting reel, and it's perfect. In either case, the floating free rig performs best when you're using fluorocarbon or monofilament. I really, really like lighter fluorocarbon, especially for the floating free rig. On a spinning, when I'm using, say, a 1/16 or an 1/8 ounce weight, I like 8 or 10 pound, 100% Berkeley fluorocarbon. When I'm using those heavier weights, 3/8, 1/2 ounce, 5/16, heavier weights on a casting rod, I love 12 and 15 pound fluorocarbon on that free rig. Berkeley, 100% trilene fluorocarbon. Man, this one is a sleeper. If you're looking to add a technique to your arsenal that's different than everything you're throwing, try this floating free rig. If you're fishing in stained, dirty, clear, crystal clear, it doesn't matter. Give this a try. And last but not least, if you see the fish, if you're bed fishing or sight fishing, or you see them swimming around and you can't get them to bite, please, please try this floating free rig. You're going to get a lot of bites you cannot trigger any other way. I hope you like this one. This was one that was hard to give you, but this is the floating free rig out here in the shop. Stop right now. If you're not a subscriber, mash that subscribe button. See it right down there? It's right there. It's red. See it right there? Mash that subscribe button. Become a subscriber. If you're already subscribed to my channel, tell your friends, tell your fishing partners and buddies about Mike Iaconelli Fishing on YouTube. We've got great educational content coming to you every single week. Give that a try. Floating free rig in the shop. Bye.